Karl Barth, one of the 20th century's preeminent theologians. Barth's had a lot of people talking about him since he first wrote his commentary on the Romans. He's world-renowned across denominational lines and even across the line of the Protestant and Catholics. Pope Pius XII said this about Barth: he's the most significant theologian since Thomas Aquinas. Mark Galli said, he did nothing less than alter the course of modern theology. And Thomas Gregg said, he is the figure you have to go around, go over, or tunnel through. Barth was trained at some of the most prestigious theological universities of his time by some of the most well-known theologians of his time. Adolf von Harnack being one of them. He was a historian and theologian. Some of the theology he was trained under was very liberal. Von Harnack is quoted as saying, Jesus was not part of the gospel, only God the Father. The meaning of the designation Son of God did not mean that Jesus was God incarnated, but rather that he had unique knowledge of God. Kind of the Gnostic revival at the time, it seems. Wilhelm Hermann was a big fan of the person of Jesus, the legend of Jesus, but maybe not the deity of Jesus. For he said, even if Jesus never existed, his traditional portrayal was still valid. Hermann Cohen was a Jewish philosopher who was a professor of Barth's in his formative years. He had a philosophy that taught a non-Marxist socialism, democratic socialism, that said the right to rule came from providing people freedom, rather than the right to rule coming from maybe the common good or the welfare of the people, but rather providing freedom. He argued publicly for universal suffrage and for the rights of workers to organize into democratically run collectives. You can see Cohen's influence on Barth throughout Barth's life. After receiving his university education, Barth went into the pastorate, where he pastored for 2 years in Geneva, then went on to Safenwil, a small rural town. There he pastored for about 10 years. During that pastorate, World War I ramped up and concluded. It was during this ramp up to World War I that Barth was confronted with his liberal theological education and its implications. For he had gotten married, he'd had 4 sons and 1 daughter, he'd even met his theological partner, his intellectual soulmate, Charlotte von Kirschenbaum, who, interestingly enough, ended up moving in and living with him for an extended period of time, became a lifelong friend. But these things were not enough when the Manifesto of the 93 came out. And the ramp up to World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II had been promoting a war footing for Germany. And 93 of the best theologians of the day, including many of Barth's professors, signed on and said, yeah, this is a good thing. We need to support this. Barth said this: I suddenly realized I could not any longer follow either my teacher's ethics and dogmatics or their understanding of the Bible and history. Everything he had learned, everything he had been taught, was brought into question. Now, interestingly enough, Barth's father was very conservative in his theology, and Barth had rebelled against his father to embrace the liberal theology of his day, and now he was repenting and turning from that. He wasn't doing it in a vacuum. He had a very good friend, a lifelong friend, Edward Thurniansen, who was working with him, struggling with him as he looked at the book of Romans and attempted to redefine his theology. This man, more than any other, helped in Barth's transformation from liberal to evangelical theologian. Both men were greatly influenced by Christoph Friedrich Blumhardt, who started out as a mass evangelist and a faith healer. He said that the call of the Christian is to give himself completely to the cause of the kingdom, not just to Christ, but to the cause of the kingdom. Later in his life, he became very politically active. He founded Christian socialism, and in fact was asked to leave his ministry position because of his political activism. Barth was also influenced greatly by some of the writings of Soren Kierkegaard, who brought out the mysticism of the person of God. That he is beyond, he is other, he is holy, never to be fully known. And this was a great influence on Barth's theology. Now, Barth's theology was Christocentric. Christ is the center of all things. In fact, the painting I put up here is Barth's favorite painting by his own admission. And you'll notice that there's the extended index finger pointing up to the central figure of Christ suffering on the cross. And it's that pointing to Christ that Barth said he liked about this particular painting, and it was the reason it hung above his mantelpiece in his house. He believed in God's absolute sovereignty and also in God's origination or authorship of the revelation of Christ, that this was a radical gospel, a life-changing gospel. His philosophy and theology is often called a dialectic theology. What this means is that in God's relationship with humanity, there is this union or oneness between grace and judgment. He was also a promoter of the Trinity as God's chosen self-revelation to mankind as an act of grace. This then coalesced into what became known as neo-orthodoxy, returning back to the orthodoxy of the Trinity as it had been taught. Barth was very well known for saying that there is an infinite qualitative distinction between God and mankind. This huge gulf between the perfection of God and the small nature of mankind, the imperfection of mankind. So much so that he goes on to say, creation itself was swallowed up in the infinitely greater act of incarnation. That was the incarnation of Christ. A couple more quotes from Barth, just to give you a feel for him. Faith is awe in the presence of the divine incognito. It is the love of God that is aware of the qualitative difference between God and man, and God and the world. Looking over the influence that Barth had over his lifetime, he says this. He says, "As I look back upon my course, I seem to myself as one who, ascending the dark staircase of the church tower, and trying to steady himself, reached for the banister, but got hold of the bell rope instead. To his horror, he had then to listen to what the great bell had sounded over him, and not over him alone." After his theological transformation, Barth went on to get a professorship at some fairly prestigious universities. Probably the most prestigious at the time was the University of Bonn. This was a great career move for him in 1930. It was at the University of Bonn that he began working extensively on church dogmatics, drawing from some of the lectures that he had done. In 1934, he became more and more involved in resistance to the Nazi state. And in 1935, he was dismissed from his position at the University of Bonn for refusing the oath of unconditional allegiance to the Nazi state. From there, he moved to Basel, Sweden, which was his home base for pretty much the rest of his life. His magnum opus was Church Dogmatics, a huge volume of theological exposition, 6 million words, 4 parts in 14 volumes. You can see the different things he covered. Now, when I read Dogmatics, I really didn't have a nice, concise definition for what it was. I just had a general sense. So I found a concise one I'll share with you. Dogmatics is the scientific self-examination of the Church's proclamation. Much of this reading is considered difficult. It takes a lot of pondering. I've just looked over a little bit of his tome on Romans, and you really have to absorb Barth. In fact, most of the theological dissertations that I've been able to find are just on a portion of what Barth wrote. Very few cover the totality of his work. Barth, as a theologian, became Barth the political activist because of the influences of his times. He was one of the founders of the Confessing Church in Germany, the resistance to the Nazi state within religious circles. He helped to author the Barmen Declaration in 1934 that said, look, you can't be a good Christian and give ultimate allegiance to the Nazi state. This eventually got him evicted from Germany. Barth, during this time period, not only struggled with the state, he struggled within theological circles to define a right foundation for theology and its application to political influences. One of his lifelong friends, Emil Brunner, and he had a dialogue back and forth talking about the application of theology to real-world politic. In fact, in answering one of Brunner's suppositions, and he believed in a naturalist theology where God reveals himself in nature, so survival of the fittest as seen in nature shows something about the nature of God, etc., etc. Barth wrote an article that said this. The article was titled, "No," a response to Emil Brunner. He said, look, this naturalist theology that you're promoting is the foundation of syncretism and also anti-Semitism that the Nazis are promoting. Of course it makes sense for them to kill off Jews if Jews could be a lesser species because survival of the fittest. So he was kind of an anti-evolutionist in that sense, though he certainly didn't get into the scientific debate. He just said, look, this is not revealing God. God is revealed in his scriptures through Christ. Interestingly enough, Barth said in his own words that he was willing to take the Nazi oath. However, he said, I'll only take it if I can say at the end of it, as far as my conscience as an evangelical pastor allows. And of course, the Nazis would have none of that. During World War II, Barth remained active from Sweden. He sent tracts and literature into Germany to help strengthen the Confessing Church. He was a liaison for them to the rest of the world. He also had direct influence on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theological formation and had some interactions directly with him as well. Once World War II was over, Barth set out to author the Darmstadt Statement and the Stuttgart Declaration that said, look, we, the church, bear culpability for what happened under the Nazis, for we were a catalyst of allowing that to happen and helping to make it happen. He also went on to provide a stinging rebuttal and debunk of Rudolf Bultmann's search for the historical Jesus that had led many theologians to remove the deity of Jesus and seek to find him rather as a historical man. He was active in promoting civil rights throughout his lifetime after World War II. Was even met and interacted with Martin Luther King, though certainly he was not part of his organization. He provided prison ministry in Basel. He could have had a greater effect, I believe, except for one piece of his theology that limited his effect in the evangelical circles to which he had adhered. He had alienated much of liberal theology because of his break with it, but he never fully embraced the evangelical idea of the sanctity and infallibility of Scripture. He believed that only Jesus was infallible, and therefore was largely marginalized by many evangelicals. He also spent a significant amount of time harmonizing election and choice. The tension between Calvin and Arminius. He said it really shouldn't be there. They should be one in the same doctrine. There is no difference. I'll close with this. Barth said, "To clasp the hands in prayer is the beginning of an uprising against the disorder of the world." That's Barth and Empire. Thanks for listening. Look